The morning after the worst blizzard Hollowmere had seen in 60 years, Calder Rusk climbed the ridge to prove a girl had died. He had told everyone she would. He had said the little stone burrow she was building in the mountain would become her coffin. He had said no one survived a northern whiteout with a handful of wood, a cracked shovel, and the scribbles of a dead woman. So when he saw the roof gone under snow, the walls buried, and no smoke above the drifts, he smiled into his frozen scarf. Then he pushed open the door. Warm air rolled over him like summer. Mara Vale sat inside in rolled-up sleeves, turning oatcakes on a black iron plate. Beside her stove lay 7 split sticks of wood, not 7 cords, not 7 stacks, 7 sticks. Calder stopped in the doorway with ice in his beard and shame already rising in his throat, because the girl he had mocked was not dead. She was comfortable, and the thing keeping her alive was not luck. It was something the whole valley had forgotten how to understand. 3 months earlier, Mara had left the girl's ward of St. Oran's home with a brown paper parcel, a broken-handled suitcase, and a legal envelope tied shut with string. She was 19 years old, which meant the institution was finished with her. The matron did not hug her. She did not pretend sorrow. She placed the envelope on the desk as if it were something mildly unpleasant and said, "Your people left you land." Mara stared at the papers. No one had ever said your people to her before. Inside was a deed to a ridge parcel above Hollowmere, an old mining settlement at the far northern edge of the Frostback Range. The land had belonged to her great-grandmother, Elsbeth Vale, a woman Mara knew only as a name that appeared once on a birth record. The matron's mouth tightened. "There is a cabin, supposedly, more likely a collapse of stones. But it is yours, which is more than most girls leave with." That was the farewell. A ruin, a suitcase, and enough coins for 2 meals. The train north ran past farms, then mills, then gray miles of spruce and rock. By the last station, the air had changed. It did not simply feel cold. It felt ancient, as if the wind had been waiting thousands of years to test whoever stepped into it next. Hollowmere was 6 miles from the station. The village appeared at dusk. One street of leaning timber buildings pressed close together under a sky the color of pewter. People glanced at Mara's thin coat, her city shoes, her suitcase with twine around it, and looked away before pity became a responsibility. The storekeeper gave her directions to the Vale parcel, with the expression of a man sending someone into weather rather than geography. "North track," he said, "past the old pump house. Then climb until the road gives up." The road did give up. It became mud, then shale, then nothing but a faint scar between black pines. Mara climbed until her legs shook. The suitcase bumped against her knee. The wind kept trying to take her breath before she could use it. When she reached the top, she saw her inheritance. A cabin had once stood there. Now it looked as if the mountain had chewed it and spat out the bones. One wall leaned outward. The roof had folded in. Snow from previous years still hid in the shadowed cracks. The chimney was split down the middle, and the front door hung open on one hinge, tapping softly in the wind like a finger against a coffin lid. Mara did not cry, not because she was strong, because the sight was so final that tears felt too alive for it. She set down her suitcase in the doorway and stepped over broken rafters into the only property the world had admitted belonged to her. Weeds had grown between the floor stones. Rainwater stood in a black puddle under the collapsed roof. A fox had used one corner as a den. On the mantel, someone had scratched 3 initials into the stone. E.V. Elsbeth Vale had been real. That made the ruin worse. For 2 days, Mara slept wrapped in her coat beside the old hearth and woke colder than she had been before. She ate the last heel of bread from the train. She counted her coins and knew they were not enough to take her anywhere else. On the 3rd morning, she walked to the ridge edge and looked down at Hollowmere. The houses below had smoke, light, voices, and roofs. Her place had none of those things. A thought came to her with frightening calm. No one is coming. It should have broken her. Instead, it made something hard shift under her ribs. If no one was coming, then no one would stop her either. She went back inside and began removing what had fallen. At first, it was not hope. It was spite with bleeding hands. She dragged rotten beams into a pile. She rolled stones away from the hearth. She tore out weeds by their roots. Every movement said the same thing. Not yet. Not like this. By afternoon, she had cleared enough floor to see a narrow stone channel running beneath the rubble, too straight to be natural. It led toward the back wall, then vanished under a mound of collapsed masonry near an old rain cistern. Mara dug with a slate shard until her fingers split. Something green with age flashed beneath the dirt, a copper tube. It was sealed at both ends with pitch and wrapped in oilcloth, so old it came apart like dead leaves. Inside was a roll of waxed pages, a small folded map, and a notebook bound in cracked blue leather. The first page read, "For the Vale child who arrives after the house is gone." Mara sat back on her heels. The wind moved through the broken roof. For the first time in her life, a dead woman had expected her. Elsbeth's notebook was not a diary. There were no soft memories, no complaints, no prayers for rescue. It was a manual. The pages were filled with measurements of sunlight, frost depth, stone temperature, wind direction, smoke behavior, and soil layers. Elsbeth had not built the cabin to look pretty. She had built it as a machine for staying alive, and the old cabin had only been the shell. The real house, the notebook said, was never meant to stand above the ridge at all. It was meant to sit inside it. Elsbeth had found a basalt shelf under the south slope, dense enough to store heat for weeks. She had mapped a dry spring tunnel that pulled air underground before it reached the living chamber. She had designed a masonry bell stove, not a cast iron box, with a firebox that burned hard and clean, then trapped the heat in a maze of stone. One page showed the stove in cross-section. Fast fire, long stone path, slow release. Elsbeth had written in the margin, "Do not feed the room, feed the stone." Mara read those words until they stopped being words and became instruction. The orphanage had taught her to survive by needing less. Elsbeth was teaching her to survive by wasting less. By sunset, Mara knew 2 things. The ruin above ground could not be saved. The buried room below it might still be possible. The entrance was supposed to be behind the collapsed back wall, where the ridge made a shallow curve toward the winter sun. The next morning, Mara began to dig there. It was ugly work, not romantic, not brave in the way stories pretend brave things are. It was mud under her nails, grit in her teeth, and pain that made her hands tremble when she tried to drink water. She used a broken rafter as a lever. She used flat stones as sledges. She used her suitcase as a basket until the bottom tore out. By the 5th day, her palms were open blisters. By the 7th, the blisters had become calluses. By the 10th, the girl from St. Oran's home no longer moved like someone asking permission to exist. She moved like someone negotiating with rock. That was when Calder Rusk rode up. Everyone in Hollowmere knew Calder before they knew the weather. He owned the lower pastures, the timber rights, the freight wagon, and half the debts in the village. His house stood at the warmest bend of the valley, 3 stories high, with glass windows shipped by rail and a furnace loud enough to be heard from the road. He sat on his horse and watched Mara roll a stone from the slope. "What are you doing to that hill?" he asked. Mara leaned on the rafter, breathing hard. "Building under it." Calder looked at the ruin, the trench, her torn skirt, her wrapped hands. Then he laughed, not loudly. Worse than that, gently, as if she were too pitiful to deserve a proper insult. "You need timber walls, a real roof, and 6 cords of dry wood before first snow," he said. "You have a hole, a child's body, and lunatic papers." Mara wiped dust from her cheek. "My great-grandmother measured this ridge for 30 years. Your great-grandmother died in that wreck. She died after leaving instructions. She left you a grave with drawings in it." The words hit the exact bruise he meant to hit. For a moment, Mara almost believed him. Then the wind passed over the ridge, dipped through the trench, and came out warmer against her wrist. Not warm, just not as cold. Elsbeth had marked that too. Mara straightened. "I'm staying." Calder's face hardened. Men like him enjoyed pity only while it remained above them. "Then, the mountain can keep you," he said. "When the first white gale comes, don't expect Hollowmere to climb up here and carry down what's left." He rode away before she could answer. But his words did not empty her. They clarified the shape of the fight. It was no longer Mara against weather. It was Mara and the ridge against everyone who thought survival had to be loud to be real. She needed tools. She needed food. She needed firebrick. So she walked back to Hollowmere with her last coins in her pocket and Calder's laughter following her down the slope. The general store belonged to Bram Kettle, a broad-shouldered man with flour on his sleeves and a burn scar across one thumb. He looked at Mara's torn hands before he looked at her face. "Russ says you're digging yourself into the hill," Bram said. "I am. On purpose? Yes." He studied her for a long moment. Most people looked at Mara and saw what had been denied to her. Bram looked as if he were trying to see what had survived anyway. She placed her coins on the counter. "I need a shovel, a pick, a sack of oats, and firebrick. I can pay for one of those." Bram glanced at the coins, then at the ridge beyond the window. "Calder says you will not last until snow. Calder says many things." That made Bram's mouth twitch. He pushed the coins back. "Take the shovel and pick. I've got chipped firebrick behind the store. Ugly but sound. Pay me in spring." Mara did not know what to do with kindness that did not announce itself as charity. So she nodded once. "I will." With real tools, the ridge began to open. Not easily. The mountain never surrendered. It only answered work. Mara dug an 11 by 14-foot chamber into the south face, deep enough that the back wall was pure basalt. She lined the sides with stones from the ruined cabin, fitting them so tightly that some held without mortar. She made mortar from clay, sand, ash, and lime, scraped from old plaster, following Elsbeth's ratios like scripture. She found the dry spring tunnel exactly where the map said it would be, a narrow passage under the rock where air moved with a faint underground breath. She ran it through a stone-lined trench before it entered the room, so incoming winter air would pass through earth before touching her lungs. Then came the stove. The masonry bell stove was less a fireplace than a stone animal. Its firebox was small, made from Bram's chipped firebrick. Above it, Mara built a chamber where flames would rise, slow, and spill heat into the surrounding mass. She shaped 2 descending channels so the hot gases would wander through stone before leaving the chimney. Each joint mattered. Each gap could poison the room or waste the heat. Some nights, she cried from exhaustion with no sound coming out. Then she washed her face, read the next page, and continued. By late autumn, Hollowmere had begun watching. Children pretended to gather berries near the lower path so they could glimpse the orphan girl carrying stones bigger than her head. Women at the pump spoke in low voices about the burrow on Vale Ridge. Men repeated Calder's opinion, because repeating Calder's opinion was cheaper than having their own. But Bram came once a week with goods in a handcart and left without making a speech. A coil of wire, a cracked iron plate, dried beans, a pane of salvaged glass. Once, when he found Mara asleep sitting upright beside the half-built stove, he covered her with a horse blanket and went back down the hill without waking her. She finished the roof on the day the pond below Hollowmere skinned over with ice. It was not much to look at from outside. That was the point. A low stone front, a small south-facing window set deep into the wall, a heavy door under a lintel from the old cabin. Above and behind it, layers of timber, reed matting, sod, and earth folded the house back into the slope until it seemed less built than uncovered. Inside, the chamber smelled of clay, smoke, mineral cold, and new possibility. The stove stood in the center, like a squat stone heart. Mara stacked her fuel beside it. Not enough by Hollowmere's standards, not even close. Calder made sure everyone knew. 7 bundles of sticks, he said at the store, raising his voice so Bram would hear. That is not a winter supply. That is kindling for a funeral. No one laughed much. The sky had turned wrong. Old hunters noticed first, then the dogs, then the horses. The air went still in a way that made every chimney smoke rise straight up as black thread. The clouds spread low and green-gray over the frostbacks. The cold sharpened until metal burned bare skin. On the battery radio in Bram's store, a voice warned of a polar front so severe that the line crackled under the words. Temperatures would plunge below anything recorded in decades. Wind would bury roads before morning. People were told to remain indoors, conserve fuel, and prepare for isolation. Hollowmere became a village of hurried fear. Wood was dragged closer to doors. Windows were packed with rags. Men checked stovepipes. Mothers filled kettles before the pumps froze. Calder stood on his porch beneath his electric lamps and boasted of his coal bin, his oil-fired furnace, and his generator house. Preparation, he told anyone near enough to hear, is not magic. It is supply. Mara heard none of it. She was on the ridge, banking snow against the north wall the way Elsbeth's notebook advised. Snow, the notebook said, was not always enemy. Packed correctly, it became insulation. At dusk, the first wind hit. It did not blow. It struck. Mara went inside and barred the door. For a moment, she stood in the dim chamber, listening. The storm clawed over the roof, but the sound was muffled by earth. The little window held. The door shuddered once, then settled. She placed 7 sticks of dry spruce in the firebox. 7. She lit them with 1 curl of birch bark. The fire caught fast, then roared. Not a lazy orange flame, but a fierce white-hot burn that filled the small firebox with clean heat. For 2 hours, Mara fed nothing more. She watched the draft, adjusted the iron plate, and waited until the stove's stone skin began to warm under her palm. Then she closed the damper. The fire died down. The stone began its work. Outside, the blizzard swallowed the world. In Hollowmere, houses fought the cold, like men trying to hold back a river with their hands. Stoves glowed red. Firewood vanished. Drafts slipped under doors and through chinks in walls. Frost feathered the inside of windows. Children slept in coats. At Calder's house, the furnace ran without rest. The machine shook the floorboards. Coal smoke pressed from the chimney in frantic bursts. Still the temperature fell. The great glass windows bled heat into the storm. The generator coughed, recovered, coughed again. In the night, the fuel line froze, the lamps died, and Calder Rusk's fine house became a dark box full of expensive coal. He dragged quilts to the parlor. He cursed the furnace. He cursed the storm. He cursed the servants who were not there. The wires, the coal, the valley, the old house shifting around him. But under all of that, he cursed the image of Mara on the ridge, because if she died, he was still right. And if she lived, something worse than cold would enter his house. Proof. In Mara's shelter, the storm became distant, not gone. Distant. The walls took the scream out of the wind and left only a low pressure, like the sea heard through stone. The stove radiated slowly. Heat moved out of it without hurry, touching the floor, the table, her hands, the air. The room rose to 65 degrees and stayed there. Mara removed her coat, then her scarf. She laughed once, softly, because the sound felt impossible. Fresh air entered through the buried spring tunnel, no longer knife-cold after its underground passage. The stove did not scorch the room. It steadied it. The basalt wall behind her gave back the day's stored warmth by degrees too small to feel until they became undeniable. The mountain had a pulse. Elsbeth had heard it. Mara had built a room around it. She cooked beans on the iron plate. She dried her socks on a line. She read the blue notebook by candlelight while the blizzard hammered over her head, like a giant trying to remember where she had gone. Every 12 hours she gave the stove another short, violent burn, a few sticks, a bright roar, then silence. By the second night, Hollowmere was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was afraid. Pipes split in 2 houses. A chimney fire nearly took the mill office. Bram moved 3 families into the store because his old brick oven held heat better than their iron stoves. People spoke less. Fuel piles shrank. The cold made everyone equal in the cruelest way. Calder's wife wept without noise under 6 blankets. Calder sat in the dark, watching his own breath appear and vanish. He had built his life on weight. Land weight, money weight, name weight, machines, contracts, beams, glass, coal, locks, ledgers. But the cold did not respect weight. It found the empty places. On the 3rd morning, the wind stopped. The silence felt stunned. Mara unbarred her door and had to shoulder it open through snow packed higher than her waist. The ridge had disappeared under white waves. The old cabin stones were gone. The path was gone. Hollowmere was only a scatter of chimney smoke far below. A thin plume rose from her own chimney, small, steady. Enough. She stood there with steam from her cup drifting around her face and understood that the deed had not given her a ruin. It had given her an argument, and she had answered it in stone. Down in the valley, Calder saw the smoke. At first he refused to believe it was hers. Then he decided he had to see. Not to help, not yet. To catch the trick. He climbed with a walking stick, and anger doing the work pride could no longer manage. Snow filled his boots. Ice formed on his eyelashes. twice he fell. By the time he reached the ridge, he was breathing like an old bellows. The shelter looked buried. Only the door top and chimney showed. No loud fire, no high stack of fuel, no sign that a human body could be warm inside. He shoved the door open. The warmth struck him first. Then the smell of oatcakes. Then the sight of Mara Vale, alive in shirt sleeves, turning breakfast over a black iron plate while the stone stove rested beside her like some patient animal. 7 sticks of wood lay on the floor. Calder stared at them. His mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. Mara looked up. She did not smile. That would have made it smaller than it was. "You're cold," she said. He stepped inside because his body was wiser than his pride. For almost a full minute, Calder Rusk said nothing. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the small window, the stove, the basalt at the back of the room. His eyes moved like a man watching a trial in which every witness had arrived against him. "How?" he finally asked. Mara set the iron plate aside. "The fire is small because it burns hot," she said. "The stone keeps what the flame would waste. The roof does not fight the wind because the hill is the roof. The air comes through the ground before it reaches me. The basalt holds heat longer than timber." She touched the blue notebook on the table. "My great-grandmother did not build against the mountain. She listened until the mountain told her where the warmth was." Calder swallowed. Behind him, boots crunched in snow. Bram Kettle appeared in the doorway, red-faced and panting, carrying a coil of rope and the expression of a man prepared to find tragedy. Instead, he found Calder Rusk speechless in a warm room that should not have existed. Bram looked at Mara, then at the 7 sticks, then at the stove. The corner of his mouth lifted. "Well," he said, "that changes the price of firewood." The story moved through Hollowmere faster than thaw. By afternoon, everyone knew Calder had climbed the ridge to find a corpse and found breakfast instead. By evening, everyone knew the orphan girl's stove had done with sticks what their iron boxes had failed to do with whole wood piles. Calder tried, at first, to call it luck. But luck does not have flue channels. Luck does not have air paths measured in feet and slopes. Luck does not have mortar ratios, stone mass, and a notebook full of 30 winters. The village changed its mind the way villages often do. Publicly, slowly, privately, all at once. People came to the ridge after the roads reopened. At first they came embarrassed. A farmer with cracked hands asked to see the stove. A mother of 4 asked whether a smaller one could fit in her kitchen. 2 brothers from the sawmill asked if earth walls would rot. Bram brought paper, ink, and a ruler so Mara could copy Elsbeth's plans without risking the original. Mara did not become grand. She became useful. She explained that heat was not the same as flame, that air leaks were thieves, that stone could be a savings account for warmth, that a house should not merely stand in a place, but belong to the forces moving through it. Some listened because they respected her. Some listened because they feared another storm. Both reasons built walls. The next summer, Bram rebuilt the store's back room around a masonry bench stove. That winter, his fuel pile lasted twice as long. The year after, 3 families cut rooms into south-facing slopes and lined them with stone. Calder's former foreman built an earth-covered dairy that stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter. The mill repaired its workers' cottages with tighter walls, deeper thresholds, and chimneys that did not throw half their heat into the sky. Calder lasted one more season in Hollowmere. People no longer stepped aside in the same way when he entered the store. They no longer treated his certainty as weather. He sold 2 pastures, then the big house, then left before the next snow. No one celebrated loudly. They had learned something about loudness. Years passed. Hollowmere's name began to mean something different. Travelers came expecting a poor, cold settlement at the edge of the range, and found houses tucked into hillsides, chimneys smoking thinly, windows deep-set and bright, children walking to school in weather that would have emptied other towns. At the center of it all, above the village, was the first little shelter on Vale Ridge. Mara grew older there. The blue notebook became soft at the corners from many hands. Its pages were copied, stained, corrected, and expanded. Beside Elsbeth's careful drawings, Mara added her own notes. How to set a door against north wind, which clay cracked, which stones held best. How much wood a family truly needed if they stopped trying to heat the sky. Children would ask her if she had been frightened during the great blizzard. Mara always answered honestly, yes. Then she would place their small hands against the warm stone of the stove. But fear is not always a warning to run, she would say. Sometimes it is a warning to learn. The mountain kept its pulse. The village learned to listen. And the girl who had been given a ruin left behind a town that no longer measured strength by noise, height, or flame, because the deepest warmth does not announce itself. It waits stone, it waits under soil. It waits in the quiet intelligence of hands that keep working after the world has already decided they will fail.